Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Week 3 video lecture for um, readings in US and British literature. All right, hopefully this will be a fun video, for me anyway. This is the part that I enjoy most, and that is really just talking about the literature, discussing it, and trying to make sense out of it for me, and hopefully for you as well. All right, just a couple notes before we get started. I want to change the schedule just a little bit. I think you won't mind. We do have Chuseok coming up, and it's a long holiday, which I hope you will all enjoy and take the time to enjoy it fully. Also, because this is our first story, The Apparition of Mrs. Veal, and some of you might be a little bit shy or hesitant or nervous about how to discuss literature, I think it might be a good idea just to spend a little extra time getting comfortable with how this class works and getting comfortable with communicating about the literature. So I want to extend our discussion time until next Thursday, the Thursday after Chuseok, the 23rd of September. All right, so we will continue with the discussion questions that I gave you last week. We'll continue with those all the way up to next Thursday. All right, so please continue the discussion in the Kakao chat room. Continue posting your answers if you haven't already, and continue your responses, the actual discussion with your classmates as well. And in this video, what I'd like to do is really go through some of the analysis in a fairly deep way. All right, maybe this will help you apply some of the elements of discussing literature that I talked about in week 1. Maybe I can give you better examples about how to apply that knowledge to your reading and then have it be used in a discussion. All right, so what I'm going to do is first just go through the list of those different elements of analyzing literature, like plot, character, tone, point of view, symbolism, imagery. I want to go through one by one with you and try to break down the apparition of Mrs. Veal by focusing on those different aspects. In doing that, I will answer obviously some of the discussion questions, but at the end I will review the discussion questions and then try to kind of go into greater detail and bring in those aspects of plot, character, setting, etc. That I discussed beforehand, and hopefully again try to bring you into the discussion or open doors or windows into the story or into this kind of project of analyzing our readings and discussing them. All right, so hopefully just illuminate or shed light on the story for you, and hopefully you'll feel more comfortable in the future with discussing this literature, and maybe it will come a little bit easier for you as well. All right, this week I will provide you with our next story, but keep in mind I will not give you the discussion questions for the second story until Thursday, the 23rd of September, after Chuseok. Okay, so as I said, for this short week, I do want us to continue and just stay on the apparition of Mrs. Veal and really have a fulsome discussion about the story, so that we can get a little bit more comfortable with the project of analyzing literature and with the whole kind of shape of this course, how this course is run, and what we can expect from each other. All right, so let's get started then. Okay, again, first I just want to go through the different aspects of literature, right? The different elements that we can use to help us discuss it and analyze it. After that, I will review the discussion questions for the apparition of Mrs. Veal and try to bring some of those elements into answering those questions directly. All right, so as always, it's a good idea to summarize the story, all right, especially when your English is not your first language, okay, because as I said before in the week earlier, just summarizing something allows you to remember it better, and remembering is often more difficult when you're using a language that is not your native language. So make sure you do summarize these stories, do so in English, and hopefully it'll help you to understand them better and remember them better. All right, so basically the plot. What is the plot of this little 8-page story? All right, well, it is a very straightforward, direct kind of story, but it begins with a preface. All right, the preface really is just the narrator telling us how the story came to him or her. We can assume it's a him, but maybe we shouldn't assume. And then how it should be trusted as well. And then after the preface, we get the relation of the apparition of Mrs. Veal. So this is the actual story that the publisher in this story is telling. Okay? And that basically is this. We have one woman, Mrs. Veal, a woman in her 30s, coming to the door of Mrs. Bargrave, her old friend, who's also in her 30s. And we know that this is on the 8th of September, 1705, and it's about 12 o'clock in the afternoon. All right, so they meet, they have a greeting, they try to have a traditional greeting, right? But Mrs. Veal says, oh, please don't kiss me, I'm not feeling well, I'm ill. So there's that aspect, which may be important depending on how you read it. But the purpose of this trip, it's been about 2 years since Mrs. Veal has seen her good friend, Mrs. Bargrave, because she moved to Dover to live with her brother, the character Mr. Veal. So she comes, they sit down, Mrs. Bargrave offers tea, but we find out all her cups are broken by her terrible husband, Mr. Bargrave. But these women just really go on to talk for about 1 hour and 45 minutes, a little less than 2 hours. And they talk about their friendship. Mrs. Veal comes really to apologize. She's a very modest woman. She apologizes for being a bad friend and being out of contact for the last 2 years. And then their discussion turns to these wonderful Protestant Christian readings that they have done about the importance of Christian values and friendship. All right, they bring up obviously the one book, Mr. Drelincourt's Upon Death, and then another one. Sorry, what is it? Dr. Kendrick's Aesthetic All right, an account on the lives of primitive Christians. All right, and it's really just talking about how to be good Christians and how to be good friends. Okay, that's what the nature of their discussion is really all about. And then towards the end, Mrs. Veal asks Mrs. Bargrave to do some favors for her, such as to write a note and also to tell her cousin about this meeting, and also to tell her cousin to carry out her will. All right, what to do with some of her belongings. Okay, because Mrs. Veal has revealed that she's going on a journey. All right, in a kind of mysterious way, going on a journey. But she makes Mrs. Bargrave promise that she will do this for her. All right, so write a note explaining what to do with her belongings, and also tell Captain Watson that they had this discussion. Make sure they know that they have this discussion. All right, then Mrs. Veal asks Mrs. Bargrave if she could meet her daughter. Mrs. Bargrave says her daughter's not here, but she'll go and try and summon her, try to bring her there. So she leaves the room to try and make contact with her daughter, to try and come and see Mrs. Veal. When she returns, Mrs. Veal has got up from the chair in the living room, or the parlor if you want, and she's now standing in the street. And there they try to say goodbye, but Mrs. Veal is like, kind of, don't touch me. It's not a good idea. So it's kind of that weird leaving, and that's really the end of their meeting. So Mrs. Veal kind of disappears down the road, and then we find out later. All right, the next day. The meeting is on Saturday. We know that because it's market day. That's explained to us in very specific detail. The day following is Sunday, and Mrs. Bargrave says she doesn't leave the house because she's feeling sick. She's feeling a bit of a cold. She seems to have caught a cold. But on Monday, she goes and visits Captain Watson, I believe the cousin of Mrs. Veal, and there. Again, she's trying to carry out the promise that she made to Mrs. Veal about telling her brother, Mr. Veal, and telling Captain Watson about the meeting. And she learns from Captain Watson that, in fact, on Friday, September 7th, at 12 o'clock, Mrs. Veal actually had died, which comes to as great shock to everybody. And naturally, you can think that or Captain Watson is a little bit disbelieving of the story, because, who is this crazy woman who says she saw a ghost? All right, but Mrs. Bargrave reveals these certain details about the dress and other aspects that are, that no one could have known unless they had seen Mrs. Veal on the day of her dying. Of course, Captain Watson doesn't believe her. He sends over two of his gentleman friends to go later interrogate her. All right, and they do. And then the other people really just try to, unbelieving of Mrs. Bargrave's story, try to find out the truth or what's really going on. They test her knowledge of the details, and each time everybody seems to be kind of maybe still suspicious, but there's so much detail in Mrs. Bargrave's retelling of the story, and some of the facts that we learn come to be true, and we learn that there's no way that Mrs. Bargrave um, could have invented these stories without hearing them. So they begin to believe the story in some way. All right. And we kind of learn that this is kind of the ghost's, Mrs. Veal's plan. She had planned to tell these stories not because the gold was important or her belongings were important. She was not a rich woman. It was important that she told those details so that people would believe Mrs. Bargrave, and then also they would believe what the ghost had to say in their discussion as well. Right? So again, it comes down to believability. And that basically is the plot here. All right? And so then we can move on to the characters. All right? There's a number of characters in this story. Some of them are more important, some are less. As always, consider the narrator a character here as well. Now, the narrator ostensibly is kind of an unnamed character, but he, most likely he, could be she, but most likely he is the publisher of this story, who was told this story by a justice of the peace from Maidstone, Kent County, England. All right. And then of course that justice of the peace had been told by this other trustworthy woman, a friend who lives down the road from Mrs. Bargrave, and who had explained the apparition of Mrs. Veal. So we learn this story has passed through many mouths to get to this publisher from a friend. All right. Of course, we have Mrs. Veal, who is this modest woman in her 30s who has died on the 7th of September, 1705 at 12 o'clock. We have Mrs. Bargrave, another modest woman and a longtime friend of Mrs. Veal, who lives in Canterbury with Mr. Bargrave, who's a bad man, apparently, who likes to break all the things, all right, in their house. There's no teacups there. There's the daughter, who's the tiniest of characters. She doesn't really make any kind of appearance in this story. We also have the cousin, Captain Watson, and his two gentleman friends who interrogate Mrs. Bargrave. And then we have basically Mr. Veal, the brother, who Mrs. Veal had been staying with at the time. And to a lesser degree, I guess we can include the original Mr. Veal, who was Mrs. Veal's unkind father. He's mentioned in the story as well. So those are the different characters and a little bit about their characters, who they are in the story, how they're presented. Now, in terms of point of view, right, the point of view of the story, again, it's told by a narrator in the third person, and that narrator is, again, talking about he, she, they, telling us, the reader, about this story, all right? And the character, of course, as I mentioned, is the publisher of this pamphlet. Now, again, there's many layers of abstraction in this point of view, right? It's a story told by one person to another person to another person. So it's kind of passed down from many mouths in this way. And in terms of a narrator, as a point of view, we are directly, we have to deal with the idea of whether we should trust not only the narrator, but all of the characters in this story as well, right? How much can we rely on or trust in the narrator? That's a question that you yourself kind of have to answer. Now, the narrator takes great efforts to be trusted right? In every mouth that retells the story, that person is by the narrator described as trustworthy, noble, credible person. All right. So that's something you might want to take a note of. All right, here, and that may be something you can join with the tone here as well. So in terms of the narration, how the story's told, what is the tone here? All right, I would say to me it seems fairly serious and straightforward. Um, but depending on how you read this, and this might be one option, you might consider this almost satirical, right? Is it oba? Is it too much? Is the narrator asking us, too putting too much stress on trustworthy, right? For example, anytime somebody says trust me before they tell you something, you're probably a little suspicious. So maybe some of you are a little suspicious of our narrator saying, trust me, trust me, trust me, all the time. All right. So perhaps this is the author's attempt, and speaking through the narrator, to maybe bring doubt onto the credibility or reliability of the narrator. Okay, I can't tell you yes or no. This is something that you have to kind of make a decision about, depending on how you read this story. All right, so is it a very serious, straightforward tone? Or is this almost kind of a hint, a wink, that this is almost satirical? All right, not to be taken seriously in that way. Okay, I'll let you decide on that. Okay, you're gonna have to make your own decisions when it comes to mood as well too. Is it serious and reflective? Is it a serious reflection of Christian values or other themes that you may read in this? Perhaps you find it calming. The mood is calming, because don't forget the purpose of the story, at least as it is stated literally. All right, this story, according to the long title at the beginning, and the connections to Drellin's Court's book of consolation against fears of death, and based on what the character of Mrs. Veal says. All right, this is a consolation against fear of death. So does it console you? Does it tell you don't be scared of dying? So in this sense, maybe the mood here might be consoling, might be comforting, or calming for some. It depends on how you read this. I think it might be a little bit different too for a reader reading in this time, because we have to kind of put our minds in what a reader might be thinking 300 years ago compared to what a reader might be thinking now. So it's difficult for us to really imagine what a reader might be thinking then, and how that purpose is accomplished in the story then and now, because of, there's a lot of philosophical differences which this story deals with, in what is material or immaterial, what is spiritual and what is physical. Okay, though that thinking has changed obviously greatly in 300 years. So consider that as well. All right. So again, tone and mood, there are various ways that you can consider them, again, depending on your experience reading this, but try to have a reason for your belief. All right, when it comes to imagery, Um, there's not a lot of imagery. This story doesn't rely heavily on imagery, in my opinion. That reflects um, Defoe's style in many ways. He is a kind of a journalist as a writer, and his style is more realistic. So there's not a lot of elaborate, complex, or flowery descriptions. It's very kind of matter of fact, right? At this time, at this place, with this person, just the facts, okay? Not elaborate, long descriptions. So it doesn't rely heavily on imagery. But just to kind of give a bit of an example here, if I had to choose what is the strongest image for me, it would be of the dress. Okay, um, and not really just for the imagery alone, but because the imagery plays into maybe the themes of the story. And also, as I mentioned before, imagery is often kind of the door to symbolism, where things represent other things. So we learn that Mrs. Veal is wearing this dress. It's mentioned, Mrs. Bargrave compliments her on this lovely dress, her death dress, actually, we come to learn. And we learn that it is scoured silk. All right. Now, this is important in its function in the story because it's one of the details that that helps to prove that Mrs. Bargrave actually met this apparition and had this conversation with her, because she would not have known that dress existed. It was a new dress. Okay. But I looked into it. I didn't actually know what scoured silk was. I'm not into fashion and textile, so I looked it up. And scoured silk, scouring, if you don't know, like I didn't, is actually cleaning of this material, silk, right? It's a way of purifying the silk to remove the color and some of the gumminess from the silk threads. All right, so what does that kind of represent in a way? It represents purity. It represents cleanliness. All right. So we can see now the imagery here of scoured, this clean silk, and how beautiful it is. That kind of imagery opens the door to this being possibly a symbol. All right. So let's move into symbolism here since we're there. All right. That imagery leads this, in my opinion, at least in one reading, to possibly be a symbol of Mrs. Veal's soul, all right, her Christian soul, if you believe, her existing. Once she leaves the body, she's wearing this dress, and it represents, again, because it's scoured silk, right? It's this cleanliness to it, this purity to it, which represents her good Christian heavenly soul. All right, and she's going on this journey, which is another symbol. All right, the journey is her death. She's dying. She's traveling to heaven. So her pure, clean soul is prepared for its journey to heaven. All right, and this is part of what she talks about in her discussions with Mrs. Bargrave. I'll talk about that more when I talk about theme. All right. If I had to perhaps choose another symbol, I might choose the gold. All right. It's one of the things she has locked away at her brother's house, and she never told anybody where the key is, but she tells Mrs. Bargrave. All right. Now, this gold, like gold, we might think of as being worth money. All right. But here, the gold itself represents more the bond. All right, because the telling of the location of the gold represents the bond and the friendship, the love between these two women, which is a kind of currency, right? And currency is a thing of value. The gold is literally a currency. But as a symbol, it represents the greater truth, the Christian values of love and friendship that these women share. We know that Mrs. Veal is a clean, purified soul going to heaven in her death, and we also know that Mrs. Bargrave is a heavenly, pious, trustworthy, credible woman through all of her characterization in this story as well. So that gold represents their relationship, and that love is actually worth more than the money, because we know the money's not worth anything. It's not a lot of money that she got. And also from what Mrs. Bargrave says, excuse me. All right. We know Mrs. Bargrave is similar kind of heavenly soul, a pure Christian soul. All right, because she's not interested in money. All right, to help support the idea that this gold is a symbol of something greater than money, but something of value. Okay, more valuable than the actual gold is their relationship, their Christian love for each other and Christian love of friendship. At the conclusion on page 8, Mrs. Bargrave says, "I would not give 1 farthing, okay, $1, to make anyone believe it. I have no interest in it." Okay, she's like, I don't care about making money off this. I'm only telling you this story out of good friendship. Okay, nothing but trouble is entailed upon me for a long time, for aught I know. And had it not come to light by accident, I would have never been made public. But now, she says, I will make my own private use of it. And she has done so ever since. All right, so basically, it's kind of a mixture of what Mrs. Bargrave says and how the narrator characterizes it. But basically, Mrs. Bargrave saying, look, I am not interested in making money from telling this story. I don't want to, write a story and make money, or talk to people about this and make money. I'm not trying to get the gold from Mrs. Veal. I had no idea that that even existed, because in her mind, Mrs. Veal was alive when she met her. All right. So, but again, she demonstrates what a pure, clean, heavenly, pious figure she is. All right. And that idea, that symbol of gold being Christian purity and value, which being more valuable than gold or money. Money is dirty, gold is dirty. All right, it's part of the material world, but these women are above the material world. They exist in the immaterial world with their souls. Okay, and that helps to support the idea that a greater reward is found in heaven. So don't be afraid of dying. All right, again, consolations against the fears of death. All right, so again, just to review here, the symbol I'm focusing on here is on the gold, which is literally a currency which has value. And the gold is part of the story. It's part of the truth that Mrs. Veal gives to Mrs. Bargrave. So Mrs. Bargrave can be trusted, and she proves her worth. And Mrs. Bargrave also, similarly, tells that she's not interested in money, even though she's not a wealthy woman. All right, because she is a good Christian woman. She's more interested in the values of a good Christian soul. All right, so that helps to support, that symbol helps to support the idea that if you're a good Christian, you shouldn't be scared of death. Okay? All right, so that's one way to look at symbolism. Okay, I'm not saying this is the only way. I'm saying this is one way to read one possible symbol. Many symbols could exist, or you might have different understandings of gold, or of this truth that is learned. But that's one way to read and analyze this. Okay, moving on. If we talk about setting, okay, setting is pretty straightforward. It happens in a variety of places. The publisher lives in London, where he heard the story from his or her friend. The actual meeting takes place in Mrs. Bargrave's home and on the street, which is in Canterbury. All right, but Mrs. Veal is from Dover, and basically that's it. And it takes place, I guess, over 3 or 4 days. Friday, Mrs. Veal dies. Saturday, the 8th of September, is when the women meet. The actual kind of tale, the apparition, takes place on Saturday the 8th. Sunday, Mrs. Bargrave is sick and doesn't leave the house. Monday, she goes to Captain Watson's and she learns that Mrs. Veal died on Friday. And then the rest of the story kind of takes place without real details, but over the course of the next couple days or months, people interrogate Mrs. Bargrave to test her truthfulness, her credibility. All right, so it's over that course of time. Basically, the story happens in Mrs. Bargrave's home and a little bit in Captain Watson's home as well. All right, also when it comes to the next thing to discuss, the form. All right, form is not really important, I don't think, in our discussion. It depends what you want to talk about. It's maybe interesting to know for history. We will consider this a short story, but keep in mind, historically, the form of short story was not developed, and this is considered one of the first modern English short stories. Okay, but the whole idea of a short story is a relatively new kind of invention. And also you need to consider how this was published. It was published as a pamphlet. Okay, maybe you've looked it up and read about it. It was a pamphlet. Pamphleteering, or writing pamphlets, was kind of popular in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, because making a book or book binding, that was very expensive and hard to do. All right, they didn't have the technology that we have today to easily do this. So a pamphlet, if you want a definition, is typically a short published work that is unbound. Okay, unbound means it's not put together like a book is put together. It's just loosely bound or not bound. Okay, so it's just a bunch of papers is a pamphlet. Okay, these days you might see pamphlets on the street. Advertisers or politicians, they might hand you a piece of paper that's folded up. That's like a pamphlet. So this may have been a pamphlet passed around as loose papers back when it was published in 1706. All right, but basically a pamphlet is 5 to maybe 50 pages, kind of like a booklet, but it's not bound with covers and binding. All right, we might also use the word tract. Maybe you've seen the word tract, T-R-A-C-T, tract. That's basically a synonym, another word for a pamphlet. Tract is something we often use for kind of religious publishing around the same time as well. And these pamphlets are among the most kind of popular ways of spreading literature, religious writings, politics, or just entertaining literature like poetry and stories and songs as well. It was popular in Europe and England especially before books became easier to publish and establish there. All right, the next thing to discuss is genre. Okay, genre. Again, we have a little bit of difficulty in history here. In our modern sense, we'll just consider this a kind of ghost story. In the time that Defoe is writing in 1705, there was a very common kind of genre called the apparition narrative. So this is not a unique kind of story in its time. It's unique in its different ways. For example, its style, as I said before, Defoe had many jobs, which may be important to this text as well. But he was a journalist, and that kind of influences his style. Like I said, a lot of this is written with facts. There's not a lot of descriptive imagery, as I mentioned earlier. The style of this is very journalistic, which is a little bit different from many of the narratives. Okay, but this is basically a kind of ghost story, if you want to consider the genre, or to sound more like a literature major, it is a apparition narrative. All right, let's move on to perhaps the most important one I asked directly in the discussion questions, and that is on theme. Right? What is this story about? Well, there's many ways to look at this, and I'll try to get into 2 or 3 different ways. Okay, but again, it all depends on how you read this. That's what I'm more interested in. All right, and you also have to kind of try to prove to us why you believe what you believe, and see if you can give convincing reasons for why you believe this story is what it is. All right, now, on its face, as I said before, the narrator tells us what this is about. Okay, it actually appears in this long title. Right, the full title of this story is not The Apparition of Mrs. Veal. Right, it is a true relation of the apparition of one Mrs. Veal the next day after her death to one Mrs. Bargrave at Canterbury, the 8th of September 1705, which apparition recommends the perusal of Drelincourt's Book of Consolations Against the Fear of Death. Right, so even in the title, we learn that, all right, this is a story about how you should not be afraid of dying, all right, according to this ghost story. So that is, on its face, what this story is about. And again, the story the ghost tells, and the content of the discussion with Mrs. Bargrave is one which supports this Christian morality. All right, live the moral life, and you will be rewarded. And if you live that moral life and are rewarded, therefore you should not be afraid to die, just like Mrs. Veal. Okay, so in this case, it's kind of a reflection on the afterlife. As I mentioned before, you got to consider the philosophy of this time 300 years ago. There was a lot of philosophical discussion by people, philosophers of the time that you would study today. They were, a lot of them, musing about the phenomenology of existence, all right, about what is material or real or physical, and what is the immaterial, all right, the body versus the soul, heaven versus the earth, all right. This was part of their discussion, and religion played a large part of that. But also in here, this is the time of Protestantism as well, the development of Protestantism. So we have this kind of these schisms, or these separations of Christianity, right? Where you have kind of the original Roman Catholic Christianity, and then these different churches and thoughts and beliefs which we'll call Protestantism, which include many different aspects of Christian belief. All right. And again, Defoe was a Protestant Christian. And these ladies obviously are too. They are talking about reading different Protestant reflections on Christian values. All right. Okay, so consider that. We can also consider kind of this as a moral tale. Like I said, it's teaching us something. All right, we can look at it that way. It's teaching us the value of friendship and Christian love, right, in a very religious way. So in that way, it teaches us the value of being a good person, just basically. If you want to try to avoid the religious aspects to a certain degree, just state it simply. It teaches us the value of being a good person. All right, and think about it that way. If we go back to genre as a kind of ghost story or horror story. Now, it's not a horror story because, Mrs. Veal's not scary. She's not like some vampire monster. She's a kind woman. She appears as a kind woman, even if she is a ghost. All right, but in that way, and we can kind of bring this back to modern times if you want help in understanding this. If you watch horror stories now, if you want to call them ghost stories, they always seem to include some kind of teaching with them. Maybe you're familiar with something a little bit later, Charles Dickens, the English writer, and A Christmas Carol, where you have the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, as well as the ghost of Jacob Marley, who try to make Scrooge a better Christian, a better person. All right, and they do that through scaring them. Right, and most people obviously are scared of the afterlife, right? Especially in the Judeo-Christian traditions. All right, and again, the story here tells us about consolations against the fears of death. All right, so this story is more positive and affirming and comforting. But if you look at other horror stories, they're more they give you the stick, very stern, negative reinforcement. This story is more of a positive reinforcement. It's a little bit happier and friendlier. But other horror stories, even modern horror stories, if you go to Netflix and watch a modern horror story, 2021 movie about werewolves or vampires or zombies or ghosts, okay, they often have some sort of moral subtext to them as well. All right, growing up watching movies when I was a kid, you always see a lot of them have to do with teenagers, right? Children who are learning, and those naughty teenagers who go with their boyfriend and girlfriend or whatever and have sex in the woods. A monster kills them, right? Teaches them, don't have extramarital sex. Right? Or the bad person who drinks too much or steals or lies, right? That person is killed in the story too by the monster. So the monsters often represent this kind of negative reinforcement. So in that ways, we can kind of connect this. Although this story is more of a positive reinforcement, it is, we can say, moralistic in that sense as well. Right? Or another one, zombies. Zombies are really popular these days. Okay, zombies, as a subtext, often are a representative, a symbol of modern society. All right? So if you want to satirize or criticize modern society, zombie movies often do that, right? They might criticize, maybe capitalism or consumerism in many ways, right? One of my favorite zombie movies, Dawn of the Dead, takes place in a shopping mall, which is a symbol of consumerism or capitalism. And that's where the zombies go, and that's where, all this death and destruction is represented as well. So it's kind of moralistic about how our society is on a negative path or highlighting some of the negative aspects of our consumerist capitalist society. Okay, that's one way to read it, or you can just enjoy the zombies eating people. All right, so that's a slightly more simplistic but similar way to look at this. All right, and perhaps you want to look at this in another unique way. I know it's a bit controversial, especially in Korea these days, but we could consider this, and other people have considered this as a kind of feminist text. All right, maybe that didn't immediately come to mind, but I think there is a good argument to be made. This is a feminist text. In fact, I was doing a little bit of research on the story, and there was one essay who the author claims that this story is actually lesbian fiction, and in that sense, kind of third wave feminist. But whether you want to go that deeply into it or not, to say this is a feminist text, well, I don't know if Defoe was a feminist or not, but I can definitely read this text in a way that supports some kind of feminist reading. And you can take it both ways if you let me explain. Look at the characters here. The main character is obviously Mrs. Veal, Mrs. Bargrave. They're both heroes in this story. They are positive characters compared to the men, who are largely negative characters. You have Mrs. Veal's father, unkind. Mrs. Bargrave's husband, okay, a wicked character who breaks all her things, right? He's characterized as a bad person all the time. Then we have what's the name? Captain Watson, who, upon hearing Mrs. Veal's story, doesn't believe her, doesn't trust her, and sends two gentlemen along with himself. They go and interrogate her. All right. So you have all these men who are suspicious of the women or treat them unkindly. So that it kind of sets up a relationship between the sexes, where the women are seen as being more heavenly, virtuous, pious, and heavenly, whereas the men are more worldly and dirty and troublesome and sinful in their depiction as well. All right, so that can lend itself to a kind of a feminist text here as well. So that's one way to consider this. Or if you want, you can also take it another step further. You might consider this is perhaps patriarchal. Okay, it might be that Defoe is trying to write a feminist text, but he's mansplaining. All right, which means he's trying to tell women what to do, and in that sense, you might read it as being not feministic, but patriarchal, in that he's portraying these women as overly pious. So he's presenting the model woman, all right, and presenting a way that women should be in society as well. All right, so it depends on what you believe and what you can really find as evidence in this story. So I'll let you consider how you want to understand to be the main story here. But the last one here too, the theme. Well, what's this story about? You can also historically say, and many people have said this, including the person who wrote the essay in 1840. That's at the end of your copy. This is just advertisement, because one of Defoe's business was publishing, and he had the rights to publish Drelincourt's Book of Consolations Against Fear of Death. Okay, so basically this story is basically Defoe Instagramming, trying to influence people to try and buy his book that he's publishing, all right? Drelincourt's book, Consolations Against Fear of Death. He's trying to sell that book, so he wrote this story as advertising to sell that story. All right, that is also something that has historical evidence to support it as well. So all of these things could be true. None of these things could be true. But what matters most is, can you explain and persuade us to believe that one way or another? Or can you shed light on ways to understand this story? How do you read it? All right, and the last thing to consider among the elements is appeal. All right, appeal, do you like it? That's entirely your answer. For me, I found the story to be cute and quaint. Maybe I'm being a little bit dismissive. It does seem kind of a little bit childish to me, but that I realize is because of such differences that exist between modern culture and culture of 300 years ago. And Defoe is writing for people who would have very serious questions about the supernatural, about life after death, about heaven and earth. Okay, these are not the questions that I have. Perhaps you have them. Perhaps you're more of a religious person who really questions these things and takes them seriously. That's wonderful for you. All right, and maybe that plays into your appeal. All right, but no matter what, the story does appeal to me because even if I'm being dismissive and finding it cute and childish, there's still so much of the characters that, even though I recognize 300 years have passed, the human aspect of these characters, it still really strikes me, right? And there's an appeal there to see something like that in the relationships of people in something 300 years ago, which is a time I can read about, but I can't really imagine, right? I can't put myself in the head of what they're thinking about when they think about ghosts. My idea of a ghost, which I don't really believe in, although I really want to, and their belief in ghosts or their belief in Christianity or the afterlife. Okay, like I said, there's great differences between what I believe and what I know and what they believe and what they knew. But I can still find a great appeal in kind of the human aspects that we find in the stories. And I still take a good delight in that. All right, so that's going through the whole list of those things to analyze. I know this video is getting a little bit long. I hope you've stayed with me. Maybe you can watch it in short forms. Now, for the discussion questions, I think I answered them as I went through most of these. All right, but just a quick review. All right, I did already summarize a short story. Do you trust the narrator? Why does the narrator put some more emphasis on trust? I think we're supposed to trust the narrator, but again, it depends on how you want to read it. I can read this as being a satire on trust, but I think ultimately, this is a technique I've seen in other stories where it is a kind of spoken traditional folk tale and like telling stories around a campfire at night to entertain each other. All right, they get passed down from one person's mouth to another person's ear and down and down and down. So he's using this to try and incorporate this kind of sense of tradition and trust as well. So I think ultimately I do trust the narrator for those reasons. All right, themes, I just discussed what it's all about. You can go and listen to that again if you want. I think all of them are plausible. They're reasonable themes, depending on which perspective I want to look at. Number 4, is there a moral lesson to the story? I would say this does contain a moral, and I would say I would probably choose the moralistic tale about Christian values, because I do think he's trying to sell books, and I do think that's what he believed in. I believe he was believing in, that pure Christian value of friendship and love, and if you are a good Christian, you will be rewarded in heaven. All right, I think that's what this story is about, and I think it is moralistic in that sense. All right, the imagery and symbolism, I gave you pretty clear examples about how the dress is described as scoured silk, and I think that imagery opens the door and allows that dress to be a symbol of the purity of Mrs. Veal's soul. All right, so the dress represents, a dress is a dress, but it's a pure silk. It's beautiful pure silk, but it represents her beautiful pure soul. Okay. The gold too, I mentioned, the gold is the currency that she had received, but it represents the bond and the love between the women, who both have as a greater currency, a greater value, their clean heavenly souls. Okay. And number 6, can you relate to it? Yes, I can. I explained that when I explained the appeal for me. Okay, you obviously have your own view, but for me, I can relate to this because of I just enjoy the curiosity. So as much as the thinking might have changed, I love a good ghost story, first of all. Even though I don't believe in ghosts, I really want to. But I can relate to the human aspects of their basic psychology of how they want to believe things, but they're suspicious as well. All right. So I think that kind of answers those questions. But remember, there's no perfect answer. There's only your answer and how well you can persuade people to that, how convincing you can be. So as I said, that's it for this week. Listen to this video. Continue the discussion. Let's get comfortable discussing, analyzing stories. Hopefully this kind of discussion I'm having now will help you with your reading, and then you can apply that in future readings as well. So continue up to Thursday, the 23rd of September, in discussing the apparition of Mrs. Veal in our chat room. And then on Thursday, the 23rd of December, I'll give you discussion questions for our next reading, The Model Millionaire by Oscar Wilde. Thank you. Take care. Happy Chuseok.